The funeral had been a blur of black suits and sympathetic nods. David, my husband of 8 years, gone at 37 from a sudden heart attack. I barely had time to process my grief when my sister Julia invited me to her son's first birthday party. I knew I needed to reconnect with life, so I went. As I sat surrounded by colorful balloons and cheerful children, Julia clinked her glass for a toast. What happened next would change everything. Before I continue my story, let me know where you're watching from, and hit that like button if you've ever experienced family betrayal. David and I had shared 8 beautiful years together. He was a successful real estate developer with a passion for creating unique homes that families could grow in. Our marriage had been filled with laughter, adventures, and dreams for the future. The only shadow that ever fell across our happiness was our struggle with fertility. For 3 years, we tried everything from fertility treatments to alternative therapies, all without success. The disappointment was crushing each month. Eventually, after multiple doctor consultations, we made the difficult decision to focus on our careers instead of continuing with treatments. David threw himself into his development projects while I expanded my interior design business. We built a wonderful life together in our $800,000 house that David had designed himself. It was our sanctuary, with every corner reflecting our personalities and shared journey. "This house is our baby," David would joke, but we both knew the pain behind his smile. Still, we found joy in hosting dinner parties, traveling, and mentoring younger people in our industries. We had created a meaningful life together, even if it was different from what we had originally planned. Life was good until that Tuesday morning when everything changed. David had been working late on a new development project. I had gone to bed around 11, leaving him at his desk surrounded by blueprints and coffee cups. When I woke at 6 the next morning, I found him slumped over his desk. The paramedics said it was a massive heart attack, sudden and fatal. Just like that, at 37 years old, my husband was gone. The days that followed were a blur. I moved through funeral arrangements in a state of emotional numbness. Friends took turns staying with me, making sure I ate, and helping me navigate the paperwork that follows death. My parents flew in from Arizona, and my sister Julia seemed to be constantly checking in. The funeral was well attended. David had been respected in the community and loved by many. As people shared stories about his kindness and integrity, I sat in the front row wondering how I was supposed to continue my life without him. I was 35, suddenly a widow with no children to focus on just an empty house full of memories. Julia and I had always had a complicated relationship. Growing up, she was 2 years younger and always seemed to be chasing what I had. If I received a new toy for my birthday, she would beg our parents for the same one. When I started dating in high school, Julia would inevitably develop crushes on my boyfriends. Our parents called it admiration, but it felt like competition. This pattern continued into adulthood. When I got engaged to David, Julia suddenly needed to be the center of attention by announcing she was moving abroad for a year. When we bought our house, Julia and her husband Tom started house hunting in the same neighborhood, despite it being well outside their price range, as Tom was a struggling artist who could barely support them. When Julia announced her pregnancy a year ago, it had been particularly painful for me. She knew about our fertility struggles, yet she called me to share the news the same week we had decided to stop treatments. I still remember her voice bubbling with excitement, seemingly oblivious to what I might be feeling. Despite the hurt, David and I had been genuinely happy for her. We attended her baby shower and helped set up the nursery. David had been especially supportive of Julia. When Tom's art gallery showing fell through, David loaned them money to cover rent. When they needed a new car for the baby, David helped them find a reliable used one within their budget. He always said family was family, regardless of any tension. The invitation to her son's first birthday party came just 2 days after David's funeral. Julia called rather than texted, insisting that I needed to be there. "Family needs to stick together during hard times," she said. Besides, little Noah adores his Aunt Allison. My initial reaction was to decline. How could I possibly celebrate anything when I was still picking out thank you cards for funeral flowers? But my grief counselor had encouraged me to engage with family rather than isolate myself. Grief needs witnesses, she had told me. And sometimes normal life events can be healing reminders that life continues. So with mixed feelings, I accepted the invitation. The party was scheduled for Saturday, just 3 days after we had laid David to rest. I spent Friday afternoon shopping for a gift for my nephew, trying to focus on the innocent child rather than my complicated feelings about my sister. I settled on a beautiful, handcrafted wooden train set that I knew David would have approved of. Saturday arrived, and I drove to Julia and Tom's rented bungalow with a knot in my stomach. The moment I pulled up, I could tell something was different. The modest home was transformed with elaborate decorations that must have cost hundreds of dollars. Balloon arches, professional signage, and even a small carousel in the front yard seemed excessive for a 1-year-old's birthday party, especially given their financial situation. Julia greeted me at the door with a quick, cold hug. "You made it," she said, without the sympathy I might have expected so soon after my loss. She took the carefully wrapped gift without much acknowledgement and directed me to the backyard where the party was in full swing. As I made my way through the crowd, I noticed strange looks coming my way. Some guests gave me pitying glances, while others seemed uncomfortable meeting my eyes. I recognized most of the faces as extended family and mutual friends, but several people I had expected to see were absent. I overheard whispers that abruptly stopped when I approached. "Is she going to tell her today?" one cousin asked another, falling silent when they noticed me nearby. Julia's husband Tom was manning the grill but avoided eye contact when I waved hello. Something felt off beyond my own grief. Throughout the afternoon, the strange atmosphere persisted. Julia seemed to be performing for the guests, playing the role of perfect mother and hostess with exaggerated enthusiasm. Several times I caught her watching me with an odd expression that I could not quite place. It was not concern or sympathy, but something more calculating. The time came for the cake-cutting ceremony. Julia had ordered an elaborate 3-tier cake for little Noah, who was more interested in smashing the frosting than eating it. After the obligatory photos and happy birthday singing, Julia clinked her glass and called for everyone's attention. She positioned me front and center directly across from her. "Today is not just a celebration of Noah's first year," Julia began, her voice taking on a theatrical quality I had never heard before. "It is also about family secrets, and finally claiming what we truly deserve." The yard grew uncomfortably quiet. Children who had been running and playing seemed to sense the tension and gathered near their parents. I felt anxiety rising in my chest, unsure where this was heading, but certain it involved me somehow. "I have an announcement to make," Julia continued, placing her hand on her son's head. "One that will change everything, especially for my sister Allison." She paused dramatically, looking around at the guests who seemed equally confused and intrigued. My heart was pounding now, a sense of dread washing over me. "Noah is not just my son," Julia announced, her voice ringing across the silent yard. "He is also David's biological child." A collective gasp arose from the party guests. I felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. "David. My David. The father of my sister's child." While Allison was going through fertility treatments, Julia continued, seeming to gain confidence from my shocked expression. "David turned to me for comfort. We never meant for it to happen, but we fell in love." I stood frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. The party guests were equally stunned, some whispering furiously to each other, others staring at me to gauge my reaction. And now Julia reached into a decorative box on the gift table. "I have something to show everyone." She pulled out what appeared to be a document. "This is David's handwritten will, one he wrote without lawyers or witnesses, but with his full intention clear." She held up the paper for everyone to see. It states that Noah, as his biological son, is entitled to inherit half of his estate. That includes half of the $800,000 house that my sister currently lives in. Looking directly at me, she added, "So as inheritance, I will take half of your house for my son. It is only fair." I felt dozens of eyes on me, waiting for a breakdown, for tears or screaming. But strangely, I felt an inappropriate urge to laugh building inside me. "Would you like to see the will?" Allison Julia asked, extending the document toward me with a smug expression. Julia seemed to have prepared thoroughly for this moment. She handed me the paper with a theatrical flourish, like an attorney in a courtroom drama. The document certainly looked legitimate at first glance. It was written on David's personal stationery with what appeared to be his signature at the bottom. As I scanned the content, Julia continued her performance for the increasingly uncomfortable guests. There's more, actually. The will also mentions David's car, his investment portfolio, and several personal items that should rightfully go to his son. She was on a roll now, seemingly emboldened by my silence. You should actually be grateful, Allison, that I'm only asking for half the house. Legally, Noah could probably claim much more. From the corner of my eye, I could see several guests discreetly gathering their belongings. This was not the birthday celebration they had signed up for. Julia's husband Tom stood near the grill, his face ashen eyes fixed on the ground. He clearly knew about this plan but seemed far from comfortable with its public execution. I carefully examined the will, noting several details, while Julia continued her tirade about inheritance rights and paternal obligations. I found myself fighting to hold back inappropriate laughter. The absurdity of the situation coming so soon after David's funeral seemed almost surreal. Julia noticed my expression and faltered slightly. Why are you smiling? Did you hear what I said? Your husband had a child with me. I folded the document carefully and simply said, Oh, I see. My calm reaction clearly wasn't what Julia had expected. She had prepared for tears for a public breakdown that would confirm her victory. My restraint was throwing her off script. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, I suggested, gesturing toward the house. No, Julia insisted, her voice rising slightly. Everyone here deserves to know the truth. I'm tired of secrets. The tension in the yard was palpable now. Parents were ushering children inside using cake and presents as distractions. Only the closest family members remained in the immediate vicinity, unwilling witnesses to what was unfolding. I took a deep breath, maintaining the strange calm that had settled over me. Something about the absolute audacity of Julia's claim had pushed me beyond ordinary emotional responses. I felt oddly detached, almost analytical, as I considered how to respond. Well, if you want everyone to know the truth, I said, my voice steady and clear, then let's make sure they have all the facts. The remaining guests turned their full attention to me. Julia's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. First, I'd like to address your claim about David being Noah's biological father. I began, speaking to everyone rather than just Julia. What you might not know is that David was diagnosed with azoospermia 5 years ago. Julia's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. That means he produced no sperm, I clarified. None at all. It was the reason for our fertility struggles, not any issue with me. We kept this private because David felt it affected his sense of masculinity, but we have extensive medical documentation. After multiple tests, specialists confirmed his condition was irreversible. A murmur went through the small crowd. Julia's mouth opened and closed without producing words. David cannot possibly be Noah's biological father, I continued calmly. Medically, it was a complete impossibility. Julia finally found her voice. Doctors make mistakes all the time. Maybe the tests were wrong. 3 separate specialists over 2 years confirmed the diagnosis, I replied. The medical records are in our home safe. I brought copies with me today because, frankly, I suspected something might happen at this party. I reached into my purse and produced a folder containing David's medical reports. Anyone is welcome to review these if they have doubts. No one moved to take them. The evidence of my preparation seemed to stun the onlookers. Julia's face had drained of color, but she wasn't ready to give up. Even if that were true, she countered, pointing to the will in my hand. That document proves David wanted Noah to inherit his property. I turned my attention to the paper. About this will. There are several problems with it. First, the signature. I pulled out my phone and showed a photo of David's actual signature on our marriage license. David had a distinctive way of writing his D's. This signature, I pointed to the will, uses a completely different stroke pattern. Julia shifted uncomfortably as I continued my analysis. Second, any legitimate will requires witnesses and proper legal formatting, which this lacks. And third, the real will was properly filed with our attorney 3 years ago with updates last year. I have the contact information for anyone who wishes to verify. Tom finally broke his silence. Julia, what is going on? You told me David had acknowledged Noah as his son privately. She lied to you, Tom, I said gently, just as she's lying to everyone here. Julia's carefully constructed performance was crumbling rapidly. Her eyes darted around as if seeking an escape route. There's one more thing everyone should understand, I added, turning to address the remaining family members. Julia and Tom filed for bankruptcy last month. Their house is in foreclosure. That explains the extravagant party today, the last hurrah before they lose everything. Tom looked shocked that I knew this information. Julia began to tremble visibly. How did you know? That she whispered. The bankruptcy filings are public record, Julia. A friend who works at the courthouse recognized your names and mentioned it to me. She was concerned because it was filed right after David's death. I turned back to the small group of witnesses. This isn't the first time Julia has tried to take what's mine. It's been happening since we were children. But forging a will and claiming my husband fathered her child goes beyond sibling rivalry. Julia suddenly burst into tears, her composure completely shattered. It's not fair, she sobbed. You always had everything. The perfect husband, the beautiful house, the successful career. What about me? What about my son? We're about to be homeless. Tom put his arm around his wife, looking both angry and embarrassed. I knew nothing about a forged will, he told me. But yes, we are in financial trouble. Julia's business failed last year and my art hasn't been selling. We maxed out our credit cards trying to stay afloat. Our parents, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally approached. Girls, this has gone far enough, my father said firmly. Julia, we need to have a serious conversation about your actions. I felt suddenly drained. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was fading, leaving raw grief in its wake. Without another word, I gathered my purse and quietly left the party. As I drove home to the house, David and I had shared. The tears finally came. Not just for David's death, but for the sister I had lost long ago to jealousy and resentment. The days following the birthday party were some of the darkest I had experienced, even compared to the immediate aftermath of David's death. The compound grief of losing my husband and facing such betrayal from my sister left me feeling isolated and overwhelmed. I alternated between periods of numbness and waves of anger so intense they frightened me. Friends who heard what happened rallied around me. My colleague Sophia started bringing lunch to my house daily, forcing me to eat when I had no appetite. My neighbor Michael handled calls from concerned relatives, shielding me from having to retell the story repeatedly. There were moments when I fantasized about revenge, about pressing charges against Julia for forgery, or exposing her lies to everyone we knew. The anger felt like a living thing inside me, providing energy when grief threatened to pull me under completely. But revenge would not bring David back. It would not heal my broken heart or help me move forward. 2 weeks after the party, I made 2 important decisions. I would seek specialized therapy for both grief and family trauma, and I would not pursue legal action against my sister. The first therapy session was brutal. Articulating the layers of loss I had experienced left me exhausted and raw. But my therapist helped me understand that my calm reaction at the party had been shock, not strength, and that the real emotional processing was only beginning. I established firm boundaries with Julia and my parents. I made it clear that while I would not press charges, I also would not be attending family gatherings where Julia would be present for the foreseeable future. My parents were distressed but understood the severity of what had happened. Despite everything, I could not bring myself to completely cut contact with my nephew Noah. He was an innocent child who would grow up with enough complications already. I agreed to occasional supervised visits where my parents would bring him to the park, so I could maintain a relationship with him without engaging with Julia. As weeks turned to months, I began to find my way forward. David had left everything in good order financially, so I had the luxury of taking time off work to focus on healing. I started volunteering at a grief support group for young widows and widowers, finding purpose in sharing my experience with others who understood the unique pain of losing a spouse too soon. 6 months after the birthday party incident, I felt the first genuine stirrings of peace. The grief was still there, but it had transformed from a crushing weight to a companion I was learning to live with. I had decided to keep the house at least for now, finding comfort in the space David and I had created together rather than painful memories. Julia and I had spoken only once, a brief, tense conversation where she offered a carefully worded apology that stopped short of taking full responsibility. I accepted it for what it was, recognizing that deeper reconciliation might never be possible. Tom had found steady work as a graphic designer, a more reliable application of his artistic skills, and they had moved to a smaller apartment in a neighboring town. The greatest lesson I learned through this ordeal was about the nature of strength. I had always thought of strength as endurance, the ability to withstand pain without breaking. But now I understood that true strength lay in vulnerability and facing grief honestly, and allowing yourself to be transformed by it, rather than hardened. David would have been proud of the way I handled everything. He always said I had a steel core beneath my gentle exterior. In honoring his memory by living with integrity, I found a way to keep him with me, even as I began to envision a future he would not physically share. The house that was meant to be filled with children may never serve that purpose now, but it has become something else equally valuable, a sanctuary for healing not just for me but for the friends and fellow grief travelers who find their way to my door. In choosing compassion over vengeance, I found freedom I never imagined possible amid such loss. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members after a betrayal? What helped you heal and move forward? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more journeys of resilience and healing. And if you know someone struggling with grief or family conflict, sharing this might help them feel less alone. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that even in our darkest moments, healing is always possible.